The first crack of trouble came just before sunset, when the small mountain town was settling into its evening routine. Shopkeepers swept dust from their porches. Children raced bicycles down the main street. Old neighbors sat on benches trading stories they had told 100 times before. No one noticed the stranger at first. He stood near the edge of town, watching. Watching the people. Watching the stores. Watching the elderly woman walking alone with a cloth shopping bag hanging from her arm. Her name was Martha Bell, and nearly everyone in town knew her. At 76, she lived by herself in a little white house near the church. Her husband had passed away years earlier, and her children lived states away. Yet she never complained. She baked pies for fundraisers. She delivered soup to sick neighbors. She remembered every birthday in town. People often joked that Martha was the town's unofficial grandmother. That evening she had finished buying groceries and was making her way home. The stranger noticed her immediately. An elderly woman. Alone. Carrying a purse. Easy prey. A cruel smile crossed his face. Across town, high on the forested slope overlooking the valley, another man was finishing his workday. Everyone called him the Mountain Man. His real name was Caleb Ridge. He lived in a log cabin miles from town. Most people only saw him when he came down to buy supplies or help during emergencies. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and weathered face, Caleb looked intimidating. Children sometimes hid behind their parents when they first saw him. But those who knew him understood the truth. He was one of the kindest men anyone had ever met. Years earlier he had left city life behind after losing his wife in a tragic accident. Since then he had chosen solitude among the mountains. He hunted. Worked timber. Raised horses. And quietly helped anyone who needed it. That evening Caleb was riding his old pickup toward town to pick up a sack of feed he had forgotten earlier that week. As he descended the winding road, he could see the main street below. Everything looked peaceful. Normal. Until suddenly it didn't. The stranger moved. Fast. Martha had just turned onto a quieter side street when the man rushed toward her. He grabbed her purse. The force nearly knocked her off her feet. She cried out in surprise. No! But the bandit yanked harder. Martha stumbled and fell hard onto the pavement. Her groceries scattered everywhere. Apples rolled into the street. A loaf of bread burst from its bag. The thief snatched the purse and turned to run. Several people saw it happen. A young mother screamed. A store owner rushed from his doorway. But nobody was close enough to stop the criminal. The thief sprinted down the street. Straight toward the edge of town. Straight toward the road Caleb was driving down. Caleb saw everything. The fall. The stolen purse. The frightened crowd. The fleeing bandit. For a split second he felt anger surge through him. Not because of the theft. Because the thief had hurt an old woman. Caleb pulled his truck onto the shoulder. The engine wasn't even fully stopped before he opened the door. People later said they had never seen a man move so quickly. The bandit raced forward, clutching the purse. Then he noticed Caleb standing in the road. The mountain man didn't yell. Didn't threaten. Didn't posture. He simply stood there. Solid as a granite cliff. The thief hesitated. Only for a second. Then he changed direction and tried to dart around him. Big mistake. Caleb stepped sideways. The movement was calm. Precise. The thief crashed directly into him. It felt like running into a brick wall. The criminal bounced backward and nearly fell. The purse slipped from his hands. Gasps echoed from nearby witnesses. The bandit looked stunned. Caleb still hadn't thrown a punch. Hadn't raised his voice. Hadn't even looked angry. He simply stared. And somehow that stare was more frightening than any threat. The thief scrambled up and pulled a knife from his pocket. The crowd froze. Several people screamed. The blade flashed in the fading sunlight. "Stay back," the bandit shouted. Everyone expected Caleb to retreat. He didn't. Instead, he took one slow step forward. The criminal waved the knife wildly. Another step. The thief's confidence began to crack. A third step. Now fear appeared in his eyes. Because for the first time he realized something. This wasn't an ordinary man. Years of chopping timber. Years of surviving mountain winters. Years of hard labor had forged Caleb into something exceptionally strong. But it wasn't his strength that terrified the thief. It was his calmness. The criminal expected panic. Expected fear. Expected negotiation. Instead he faced a man who looked completely unshaken. The knife suddenly seemed much smaller. The thief lunged. The crowd screamed. What happened next occurred so fast many people later disagreed about the details. But everyone agreed on the outcome. Caleb moved. One swift motion. The knife clattered across the pavement. The thief found himself face down on the ground. Pinned. Unable to move. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 3 seconds. Silence swept across the street. Then applause erupted. People emerged from stores and sidewalks. Someone called the sheriff. Others rushed to help Martha. Caleb immediately released the criminal once he knew he could no longer escape. Instead of celebrating, he walked directly toward the elderly woman. Martha was sitting on the curb, shaken and bruised. Her eyes filled with tears when she saw him approach. "My purse," she whispered. Caleb picked it up and gently handed it to her. "Nothing's missing," he said softly. The old woman clutched it against her chest. Relief flooded her face. Then she surprised everyone. She reached out and took Caleb's rough hand. "Thank you," she said. The mountain man nodded awkwardly. He never liked attention. But Martha wasn't finished. Looking up at him, she quietly asked a question. A question that made Caleb freeze where he stood. And in that moment, the entire town sensed that something far bigger than a simple robbery had just begun. Martha's trembling hand remained wrapped around Caleb's rough fingers. The crowd expected her to thank him again. Perhaps offer a blessing. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes and asked a question that seemed to steal the air from his lungs. "Are you Daniel Ridge's son?" Caleb froze. For a moment he couldn't speak. The name struck him like lightning. His father had been dead for nearly 20 years. Few people in town even remembered him anymore. The crowd grew quiet. Even the sheriff, who had just arrived to take custody of the bandit, paused to listen. Caleb swallowed hard. "Yes," he finally said. "I am." Martha's eyes immediately filled with tears. A small smile appeared on her weathered face. "I knew it." Caleb stared at her in confusion. "You knew my father?" The old woman nodded. "Very well." The mountain man's heartbeat quickened. He had never seen this woman before. At least, he didn't think he had. Martha motioned toward a nearby bench. "Sit down for a moment." Normally Caleb avoided crowds and conversations. But something in her voice stopped him from walking away. Slowly he sat beside her. The townspeople gathered nearby, curious about the unexpected exchange. Martha took a deep breath. 40 years ago, I was a young widow with a 6-year-old daughter. Caleb listened carefully. It was winter. Much colder than tonight. She glanced toward the mountains. The factory where I worked closed without warning. I lost my job. Her voice trembled. I had no money. No family nearby. No food left in the house. The crowd listened in silence. Martha continued. For 3 days I pretended everything was fine so my daughter wouldn't worry. A tear rolled down her cheek. On the 4th day, I didn't know what to do. Caleb felt a strange knot forming in his stomach. Martha smiled sadly. That evening there was a knock at my door. She looked directly at him. It was your father. Caleb said nothing. He had somehow learned about our situation. Martha's eyes glistened. He brought groceries. Firewood. Blankets. Her voice cracked. And an envelope with enough money to help us survive until I found work. The crowd exchanged surprised glances. Martha squeezed Caleb's hand. I tried to repay him later. What happened? Caleb asked quietly. She smiled. He refused. A few people chuckled softly. That sounded exactly like the stories many had heard about Daniel Ridge. He told me that one day I should simply help someone else. The old woman's eyes filled with emotion. And that's exactly what I tried to do for the rest of my life. Caleb felt his throat tighten. His father had rarely spoken about the good deeds he performed. In fact, most people never knew about them at all. Daniel Ridge had believed kindness was something you did quietly. Without recognition. Without reward. Martha looked around at the gathered crowd. Every pie I baked. She smiled. Every family I helped. Every child I watched after school. She pointed gently toward Caleb. That kindness started with his father. The street became completely silent. Many townspeople suddenly understood why Martha had spent decades helping others. Her generosity had been a gift passed from one person to another. A chain stretching across generations. Caleb looked down at the snowy ground. For years he had carried the pain of losing his wife. After her death he had isolated himself in the mountains. He worked alone. Lived alone. Avoided people whenever possible. He told himself that was enough. But sitting beside Martha, hearing the story of his father, something stirred inside him. A memory. He remembered being 12 years old. His father returning home late one winter evening. His boots covered in snow. His face exhausted. Caleb had asked where he had been. Daniel had simply smiled and said, helping a neighbor. Nothing more. No details. No bragging. Just helping. Now, decades later, Caleb finally understood. The impact of those quiet acts had lasted far longer than his father could ever have imagined. The sheriff led the handcuffed bandit toward a patrol car. As they passed, the criminal glanced back. His expression was no longer arrogant. No longer threatening. Just ashamed. He had attacked an elderly woman believing nobody would stop him. Instead, his actions had unintentionally revealed a story of courage and kindness that inspired an entire town. After the patrol car disappeared, people slowly began returning to their homes. But many stopped to shake Caleb's hand first. Some thanked him. Others simply nodded with newfound respect. Not because he had overpowered a thief. But because they now saw him differently. Not as the mysterious mountain man. Not as the lonely giant living above town. But as Daniel Ridge's son. A man carrying forward the same values his father once lived by. As the crowd dispersed, Martha reached into her purse. She pulled out an old photograph. The edges were worn with age. Carefully she handed it to Caleb. He stared at it in shock. The picture showed a young Martha standing beside a little girl. Next to them stood his father. Smiling. One arm resting on a stack of firewood. Caleb had never seen the photograph before. His eyes filled with tears. For several moments he couldn't speak. Finally he whispered, "Thank you. Martha smiled warmly. No. She gently touched his arm. Thank you. That night Caleb drove back to his cabin high in the mountains. The stars shone brightly above the snowy peaks. The road twisted through forests illuminated by moonlight. For the first time in years, he didn't feel quite so alone. When he reached home, he placed the photograph on the mantel above his fireplace. Then he sat quietly, staring at it. Thinking. Remembering. Understanding. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than it had in a long time. Because Caleb finally realized something important. Strength wasn't what people remembered most. Not muscles. Not fights. Not victories. People remembered kindness. People remembered compassion. People remembered those who appeared when life seemed darkest. His father had understood that. Martha had understood it. And perhaps now, at last, Caleb understood it too. The next morning, something unusual happened. The mountain man came into town again. Then the next week. And the week after that. He began helping where he was needed. Repairing fences. Delivering firewood. Fixing roofs after storms. Never asking for payment. Never seeking praise. Just helping. Years later, when people told the story of the night a bandit attacked an elderly woman, they rarely talked about the fight itself. Instead, they spoke about what happened afterward. How one act of courage revealed a hidden legacy. How kindness traveled from father to son. How a frightened old woman reminded a lonely mountain man who he truly was. And how that single winter evening changed not only one life, but an entire town forever.